Welcome everybody. My name is Steve Martin from Omni Productions. It's a local video production company here in Orlando. And this is the second in a series of webinar broadcasts that we've put together to try to help small businesses understand the Payroll Protection Program, otherwise referred to as PPP. Our first episode was last week, and we had as guests Darren Soto, congressman from our Central Florida area, and Marcos Marchena. If you didn't get a chance to watch that one, it is available on Omni's Facebook page, so go back and review that if you haven't had a chance to. And we're going to be building on that information. Our goal today is to try to describe some of the details of what's going on with this program and give you actionable information so that you can move forward with a decision as to whether or not to apply, and some of the details that go along with that decision so that you can be prepared when you're dealing with your bank. The first thing I want to talk about is the fact that this process is fluid. What is true today may not be true tomorrow, and it's different from what was true yesterday. So the best thing that you can do is once you've started this process, is understand that your bank is going to be your first line of defense along with your CPA, making sure that you've got the right documents and all of those things. The SBA has given, or the law gives the SBA great authority to generate rules and change those rules as this process goes around a little bit. And while they're doing the best that they can, the reality is this is a massive program that got spun up on a dime, and it's moving very, very quickly. So talk to your bank. We're going to try to dispel some of the rumors and some of the problems and some of the issues going along so that you're better prepared. With that, let me introduce our panel. We are going to be relying on Scott Michaels from the CPA firm Strombeck Consulting and CPAs. He is going to be joining us to answer questions from our small business panel. We have four of them, including myself, excuse me. First, let me introduce Susan Sutherland from the Just Events Group. Say hello, Susan.
Good to see you again.
Great, thank you for joining us. We also have Bob Hyde from We Are Chimera, a marketing group here in Central Florida as well.
Good morning, Steve and Scott. Thanks for showing up.
And we've also got Pete Newsom from Four Corners Resources, which is a staffing company also here in Central Florida.
Good morning, Steve.
With that, let me introduce you all to our hero this morning is going to be our CPA, who we're going to be peppering with questions and trying to keep this process moving along. Scott, if you could just give us a little short introduction on yourself and your firm so that everybody knows where you're coming from.
Thank you, Steve. I work with Strombeck Consulting, and as a firm, we work exclusively with business owners. More specifically, business owners are looking for some level of advice from their CPAs. And you use the word CPA and hero in the same sentence. That's something I've been waiting for about 25 years of my career.
Oh, there you go, my friend. It's all there for you.
Thank you, Steve. This is a day. So not used to being real popular, but these last 2 weeks, we have certainly increased in popularity. And these are the types of things where our clients interact with us is for the advisory role, and certainly no shortage of that right now.
Well, great. Thank you so much for being part of the show today. Your advice is going to be very helpful to our viewers. Let's start off with our first segment. Let me kind of give you a quick rundown, everybody. We got 4 segments for our show today. Segment number 1 is to kind of walk through very quickly the updates from last week's show. There's been some changes and some updates, and we want to talk about those very quickly. But then we're going to get into the real meat. We're going to talk about getting ready for your PPP application, and we're going to ask Pete to run that piece of our conversation. The process of applying with your bank is going to be segment number 3, and that is going to be run by Bob Hyde from We Are Chimera. And then finally, there's a whole bunch of special circumstances that we're going to ask Susan Sutherland to kind of run that piece of the conversation, and hopefully between these 4 things, we're gonna answer your questions along the way. So for segment number 1, the updates from the program last week, the big thing that I can think of is last week we talked about the interest rate for the unforgiven portion of this loan was going to be 4%. And then it went to 0.5%. Where are we now, Scott, and that and the amortization process and how that changed?
Yeah, so as of last Thursday, when they kind of went through the final tweaks between the banks and the SBA, they did come up with a 1% rate, and that would be amortized over 2 years.
Perfect. So for those of you who are kind of paying attention, remember that this loan is forgiven assuming that you use the funds to keep your people on payroll or bring them back onto payroll if you've already had to furlough them. And that is the 8-week period immediately after the closing of the loan. Now, we were talking a little bit offline, and I think this would probably be a good time to talk about that with Scott. Why does the date of the loan closing matter, Scott? And talk to our audience a little bit about that.
And I got 30 seconds for this answer. Great,
Yeah.
Steve. Appreciate it. All right. So the timing is critical because depending on the nature of what's going on in your business, some businesses are literally shut down right now. A dentist office cannot statutorily help anyone or do their business. So for them, they're going to be shut down. It would be not a great situation for them to originate their loan right now because they would have a number of weeks with next to zero payroll in a normal time. So on the flip side, there's a risk that money can run out. On the third scenario is there's people who are very busy right now, but they know that they're doing work that was in the pipeline, and that pipeline is going to run out. For instance, perhaps mortgage businesses or real estate businesses where there were already things queued up, and so those are playing out. But now people have been locked down for the last 2 or 3 weeks. There's going to be a gap there. So learning and knowing your business and that cycle is very important. The origination date is the key. So the origination date of your loan will matter. So it's not your application date. You've applied, you've got all signed, you've done everything, and now you're getting the paperwork to sign. That's the date that's going to matter.
So to remind our viewers then, the key here is once that origination date hits, the payroll amount over the next 8 weeks is going to be the determining factor for the forgiveness that you're going to apply later for. Do I understand you right, Scott?
Yeah, thanks for clarifying that. So there's two elements, and initially when this came out, we heard June 30th. Your head count at June 30th is what's going to drive the whole deal. We're like, well, that's easy. We can do this. And again, it's super important that we talk about this in conjunction with the unemployment component of this, that someone who's making $30,000 a year and not getting any health benefits is in a better position to actually be on unemployment right now. Now, there's a whole separate dialogue with that. But so if you were just trimming down in normal times, you would trim down, get lean and mean, and go through this process. If you're looking at that, the reality is now we've got this additional component that says 75% of whatever you are going to get forgiven has to be spent on payroll. So if you put everybody on unemployment and you originate your loan right now, your capacity to spend 75% on payroll related costs is going to be very impacted. So that's kind of this timing exercise.
Perfect. Thank you for that explanation. And so the short version of this topic is you need to talk to your CPA, you need to talk to your bank, and you need to coordinate your process before you get too deep and just go willy-nilly and doing things that could come back and bite you a little bit later.
And Steve,
Yeah.
if I may just interject on that, number one is get as much as you can, but be talking to your CPA as soon as possible so that you can maximize the amount that's forgiven, because a 1% loan with 2-year amortization, you're not going to find that anyway. So, but carry on.
Great. Thank you. Appreciate that. One of the other things that has been a little bit confusing since our program last week was the status of 1099 employees. Now, I'm not talking about if you are a 1099 employee and you want to apply for the PPP. What I'm talking about is companies that have a payroll, but they also have 1099s. And my example is perfect. As a video production company, we have a small staff. We have 9 people that are on payroll, but a big part of what we do is we hire freelancers, cameramen, audio, and things like that. My understanding is that at first those 1099 employees were going to be included in the calculation for the payroll amount, but that seems to have shifted at the last moment, and there seems to be some confusion. Scott, can you talk to that very quickly?
Yeah, great question, and I appreciated Pete's input on that. And that's kind of was our position as well, is that with the PPP, in fact, opening up this Friday is the independent contractors portion of being able to apply for those funds. And so what they receive as a 1099 will be factored into that equation. So to avoid the double dipping and to streamline the underwriting process, that was determined that the 1099s were not going to be included. However, even in light of that, there's still some banks who are there's a little bit of a back and forth. But as a firm, we take the position that 1099s are not to be included.
All right, perfect. So again, talk to your bank, and if anything's changing between the time you watch this and the time that you apply, they're going to be the ones that are best able to tell you where their situation is. And with that, I'm going to get ready to change over our discussion a little bit. But before I do, I just want to kind of mention, keep saying talk to your bank, talk to your bank. It could be credit union as well. So long as they're an SBA approved lender, they can administer this PPP program. Understand that every bank is interpreting the rules from the SBA and the application process, and they're running those rules through their own system, their own plumbing, to use Scott's term that we talked a little bit offline. And it might look slightly different. So if you talk to a friend who's got a process with Bank of America and another one with Chase and another one with Seacoast or whatever the case may be, understand that process may look slightly different because the bank is the one who is charged with administering this loan and getting it sent up the pipeline. Anything, Scott, that you can add to that before we move on to our next segment with Pete?
No, you're absolutely right. And the reason is because the banks, now the flip side of what you just said is the banks are in charge of filtering this information, but in every application I've seen so far, they're saying, look, we're just the servicer. And so you need to make sure that you have legal counsel or accounting counsel telling you what you should include. So that would be one thing I would say to any business owners: don't be tricked into thinking that whatever you can get the bank to accept, you're safe, because they are not, by way of everything that you're signing, they're not saying, hey, we agree with all of this. They're just saying we are a servicer. So
that is a perfect segue, because our next section that I'm going to ask Pete to ask some questions, but before we do our other panelists have anything to add on segment number 1 that we've just talked about with the updates before we move on?
No, good stuff.
No, I think you covered it.
Good, excellent. So with that, Pete Newsom from Four Corners Resources, I know that you have some questions for Scott about the process of getting ready for the PPP application. Getting your documents ready, making sure that you understand. I'll let you take over, sir. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Steve. And Scott, thank you so much for doing this at a time where clarity and insight is hard to come by, and that's probably a big understatement. So we're all trying to figure out what's going to be needed from a paperwork standpoint. So I want to ask a few questions about getting ready to apply for the PPP loan. So if I have someone that I'm using who helps process my payroll, a CPA, a bookkeeping service, or even an in-house employee, what documents should I be asking them for? What do I need to have in preparation to begin the application process?
Yeah, it's a great question. And from the simplest to the most expansive, from the simplest is just your quarterly 941s as a checksum of this is what I'm going to be reporting as payroll. In addition to that, your health insurance documents is another big one. And again, the way that this works, it's curious that your gross wages actually don't show up on your W-3 or on your 941s if you have a health insurance program, a group health insurance, because that gets taken out before it shows up on any of those lines. And as a result of that, it's important that that's why you get to claim the full amount of your health insurance. And so I'm thinking those are the two main ones. And then a W-2 for anyone who earns over $100,000, because that's what they're going to do to equate out that piece of, okay, who earned over 100,000 and subtract that out. And then your state unemployment insurance tax returns. So in Florida, they're the reemployment tax RT6s, and so that would be I think those are the primary pieces of documentation that you need. Now I've heard others banks, and this is where Steve mentioned the banks have a lot of latitude in terms of what they're requiring, and they're sometimes requesting all of the bank statements and this and that, which is a little bizarre because they already have that stuff. So one final piece is that some of the banks are requiring a month by month payroll. And so again, some of the payroll service providers are actually providing a summary that's really nice. It says this is exactly the wages, the withholding it doesn't matter any longer, but and then the amounts that are over 100,000. So some of the payroll services are providing that, and whatever you can summarize for your bank streamlines your capacity to get your application through the process.
Great, thank you. And I'll tell you, my payroll service provided that report that you're mentioning, and it was great. It was very clean. It had their logo on it, very official, and it wasn't something that we had to produce on our own. And one more thing that I know is important in this that I'll just mention is that this report that was given to us also specified which employees, if any, were outside of the U.S. I know that's a part of the SBA application, and so that's something for sure to be aware of for anyone who hasn't yet applied. That question is certainly something that you're going to need to answer to if any of your employees aren't U.S. residents. So thanks for that answer. What if I'm doing the payroll on my own through QuickBooks? I process it myself. Does the answer change at all if I don't have a third party that's involved?
It doesn't change. And QuickBooks has really good reporting. So at the end of the day, the fundamentals are going to be the same, is that you're going to want to have whatever you're providing as far as your monthly detail to have that tie out to your W-3. And that's where I say that the W-3 tie out to your monthly gross wages is going to include the reality of any cafeteria plans, any kind of group health benefits or whatever that are being subtracted before that. But that would be the only thing that I would say to it, is just that because if you have it where it's a big branded payroll company that's providing your report, that carries a lot of weight. If you're cranking it out yourself, it's going to be a little more involved. Now, I will tell you, QuickBooks has been publishing a lot of stuff on the web right now that they are actively working on some of those reports. And I think that once that happens, it might be too late. But once that happens, that will probably add a lot of credibility in terms of a tie out.
Great. And what about, Scott, if since we're talking about small businesses here, distributions are often a large component of overall compensation for the owner. How do we treat that?
Great question. So the reality is, because this has the big P word in it, right? Payroll protection program, is that it is for payroll. And for anyone who owns a business, you know that one of the beautiful things about owning a business is that you can take distributions without having to be hit with payroll taxes. As a result, those distributions are not going to be allowed to be calculated into this. However, if you have a partnership and you're taking guaranteed payments are subject to self-employment tax. And so therefore those are allowed to be incorporated into this calculation. So the rule of thumb is, if it's getting taxed with payroll taxes, you can get it. Not income tax, but payroll taxes.
Great, thank you. That's great information. So the last question I'd ask in this segment is there anything else we didn't cover that I should ask my CPA or bookkeeper in advance as preparation for the application process?
No, I think that's a good, very conclusive.
Wonderful. Thank you again.
I do have a couple of follow-up questions on this segment, if I may. One thing is that you mentioned the $100,000 limit, and I know that we covered this in detail in our last show, but very, very quickly, Scott, my understanding is that if the owner or any employees earned over $100,000, any amount over that $100,000 needs to be excluded from the calculation for the payroll protection program. Is that correct?
That is correct, and yet it also creates a bit of a complexity, because in terms of looking at your total insurance, health insurance payments, likely, you're going to have a single number that you're paying. That's all line itemed by employee, but I just, from what I've seen and gathered, that's going to be one of those little touch points of whether that's going to be necessarily enforceable from a practical standpoint.
So
But
for
so I
a
have heard both ways on that.
So if you as an owner are paying yourself for over $100,000, or if you have employees that make over $100,000, just be aware this is a potential catch point, and you probably need to be talking to your CPA to talk about how to break those things out from your payroll reports. The second piece that I wanted to kind of bring up here is a follow up on Pete's question. He asked about distributions and things like that. What happens with a 1099 employee? Excuse me. I said that incorrectly. A self-employed person who is paying himself a small payroll, and then he's also taking distributions. At the end of the year, he will end up paying that self-employment tax, correct?
That's a good question and requires a little distinction and probably longer than 30 or 45 seconds.
I'll give you
So it
60.
depends on the nature. If they own an S corporation, right? So if they're taxed as an S corporation, so it's an LLC or a corporate, whatever, but it's taxed as an LLC or taxed as an S corporation, at the end of the year, there is no payroll taxes on any of those distributions. Okay. If it's a partnership, whatever money is earned in that partnership does get taxed as self-employment. So that's a distinction that again you'd want to run upstream through your advisor. But as a rule, that's a catch point, because as advisors we tend to say, hey, minimize your payroll portion because you're getting taxed on that. The IRS says you have to pay yourself a reasonable compensation, and so you have to do that. But we really like maximizing the amount that you don't have to pay payroll taxes on, except for this once in a possible, hopefully once in a lifetime scenario where it's like,
let's
man, I
hope
wish I
so.
would have paid myself a whole 100,000. But yeah.
Right. Yeah. Let's hope this is a once in a lifetime situation. Bob and Susan, did you have any follow-ups for this segment here?
Not
No,
right
I
now.
think it was really well covered.
Well, that's because
Exactly.
Scott is just that good. All right. So with that, thank you, Pete, for those
Pete did most
questions.
of the answers.
Yeah, we're a little bit prepared. It's not like we're running off of a script, but we do have an outline that we're working from. Bob, talk to us a little bit about the questions that some folks are going to have about applying for it and that process of dealing with your bank. I know that you yourself have had your own challenges in that process for your own business. So walk us through some questions that people are going to have.
Great. Thanks, Steve. And thanks for being here, Scott. One of the basic questions I've got is, who am I really supposed to be talking to? Am I supposed to apply through the SBA? Am I supposed to apply through my bank? Do I have a choice of banks that I can be going to? What's the answer here?
Great question. And of course, you know the answer, but great question. So the reality is that you want to, okay. Can I give you an analogy? The analogy would be this: is if you're at a food truck venue, right? And all the food trucks are there, and you can go up and you can grab a number from any one of the food trucks, right? You haven't placed your order, you've just taken a number, and you have no idea what the sequence of that number is. If you're hungry, you're going to grab one of those tags from every food truck place, right? And then you're going to get a call that says from one of the food trucks, hey, we're ready for your number. And you're going to run over there and you're going to place your order, right? So in this exercise, here's what I will tell you: that if you're in this banking food truck environment right now, most of the banks, because of the regulations that they're under and so forth, are saying, look, we're only going to deal with people who've bought from our food truck before. So they're not even going to let you take a number. And when I say take a number, those are some of the things you might have gotten from your bank where it said, hey, put in your information. It's kind of like an intent, like I want to get this done. So put in some basic information, but certainly not the full application. So what you want to do, if you're hungry, you would go to every one of those food trucks, and then we'll follow up that with, once you go to the food truck to place your order and you look in there and you see that they don't have any of their cooking stuff set up, you may still wait till you find another food truck that when you show up, it looks like, hey, these guys are ready to cook. So the two things is number one, I would get as many of those numbers as possible, because you're at their mercy. If you're just sitting there waiting for one of them, man, they may never show up. Or if you get called by someone, you want to make sure that, hey, what does this look like for you guys, especially on the smaller bank situation. All right.
Fantastic answer, and thanks for the analogy. Made it really clear. Again, going into the application process, I've heard that some of these can be really cumbersome. I've heard that some of them are fairly easy. There's some discrepancy as to what kind of information needs to be input on these applications. Who should I trust, and what's the right story?
I would say, I know for my own sake, as our firm, we serve as CFOs for a number of clients. So I may have 100 clients, but then I serve as an outsourced CFO for like half a dozen to a dozen. As a result of that, being in that role with my clients, a number of them, I've gotten to see quite a breadth of different banks, how they're processing, what their exercise looks like, how good their plumbing probably is, which ones have actually gotten through to the SBA. I only say that to say most likely your CPA or your advisor should, and if they don't, probably need to revisit that, but they probably have a pretty good place where they're sitting from, where they can see what's going on in the marketplace. And so I definitely would be communicating with my advisors. A banker is unfortunately going to be a little too biased to ask this question of, right? You can't go to your Chase banker and say, hey, are you guys the best out there? I mean, that's a biased person, right? So, however, if you talk to your advisors, maybe even your insurance guys, people who are your attorneys, people who are seeing across the gamut of business owners, they're probably really good folks to be communicating with at this time.
Fantastic, thanks. How's the forgiveness program going to work?
Can't answer that question, no. So here's been our firm policy is that we are focused 100% on maximizing the amount of this money that you're going to get, right? That's step one, focus on that. Until you have that money in your bank, that needs to be your focus. The second that you are in that space where you get that call that says, hey, it's been applied, we're going to get the money, and there's going to be an origination date, that's when you need to be kind of already thinking just outside of all of your activities of applying. You're thinking, how am I going to spend that money? Then what we're going to find out, you've seen how much change there's been in the last week regarding the regulations, the little nuances. This can be included, that can be included. The whole focus of all of that all the teams of people that have been going through that exercise are now shifting their focus over to answering all these questions regarding forgiveness. And so the reality is this, is that we know that 75%, or we know as of right now, 75% of that debt or that money has to be spent on payroll related expenses. How liberal is that going to be is going to be a very unique question, because if I do bonuses typically in December, guess what I'm going to be doing this year? If it stays that way, I'm doing my bonuses in June. And if I have a daughter-in-law, or right, I'm going to be becoming very, very, very generous with my payroll dollars when it's someone else and I'm getting a 25% kicker, actually a 33% kicker. Super important to clarify, Steve. I know this is going on over 30 seconds, but this is important. 25% of the money has to be spent on, or only 25% can be spent outside of payroll related expenses. What's important to know is that doesn't mean 25% of your payroll. 25% is actually 33% of 75%. So it's really 33% on top of whatever you're spending in payroll, you're getting to use for other related expenses. And so that's where, and Bob, I apologize for going off a handle, but I get the most excited about that, because that's really where this next week is going to be fully focused on, is how do we maximize the forgiveness?
That's fantastic. And it's exactly the question I'm wrestling with myself. And I think I know a CPA I'm going to call to to work.
Well, Bob, hopefully you're talking about me. I don't know, but if so, I'm excited to talk to you.
A couple other quick ones. One is a big question of, am I going to have to personally guarantee this loan?
Oh, isn't that the best? And this is so important to be very, very clear. There are a lot of business owners that this is their first experience with the SBA. And they're going to picture the SBA being like Santa Claus, right? It's like, oh my gosh, SBA, everything they give you, there's no guarantees. The paperwork was so easy. Oh my golly. Talk to anyone who's ever gone through a traditional SBA process. This is the exact opposite of that exercise. Now, again, the SBA fills a very important role, but as a rule of thumb, it is a lender of last resort, is what we would refer to it as, right? They have to collateralize everything. They'll come after your house, everything else. And so, very, very important that we get that communication out into the business community. Do not think of the SBA as the PPP. They're facilitating it, and praise God they are, but wow, it's a different animal than what we're used to dealing with the SBA.
So the short answer to that question, though, to just jump in, the short answer is no, you don't have to do a personal guarantee, right?
Yeah. Do you want me to freeze frame and say that so you can edit out all that other stuff?
No, I like the answer. It's perfect.
No. All right.
All right. Scott, one last compound question here. What's the deadline for making this application? And if I wait too long, are they going to run out of money?
Okay. I'm going to answer the second part is that could happen, though I do think that they're going to probably extend that if need be, but they could. Yeah, anyways. The first part, Pete, I'm going to ask you, or Bob, you probably guys know the answer. Is it up through June 30th? I actually have not. I've told all my clients it was last Friday, so.
No, it should be June 30th.
Right.
But you know that's an important question. You know, if I could just build on your food truck analogy quickly, I know on Friday when this thing went live, I felt like everyone was already being served by the food trucks, and I was the only one not eating. We've since realized that's not really the case.
Right.
So you know, how worried should we be if we don't have any approval so far, if we haven't even submitted an application, or if we haven't received funding?
Great question. And, this is one of those sense of urgency and patience paradoxes, is that I wouldn't be worried, but I would have a very high sense of urgency until I get a warm fuzzy that my application isn't just in, but is into a place that I can watch a little status bar moving along. This whole idea of, hey, we got you covered, reminds me of when I was a couple points in my life, and I'm sure you guys have had those same deals, where I went and was actually buying a car once at an auction, and the guy's like, yeah, we're good, we're eating lunch, we're doing this and that. I'm like, I want this car. And we just watched it go past the thing, and he's like, yeah, we're not. I'm looking at him like, how did that happen? He's like, yeah, it happens. Sometimes we don't get our car. I'm like, so I would definitely keep a sense of urgency and be talking to somebody. I know Susan mentioned she had an experience where they were very verbal and they were talking. This is when I'd want them to be verbal and talking, is tell me, where am I in this queue to be seeing something? Basically just act like you're hungry at a food truck place. It's pretty much how you need to act.
Great. Bob, do you have any other questions?
That covers it right now. Thanks again, Scott.
All right.
All right. Thank you, Bob.
All right. So unless our other panelists have another question for Scott on this particular topic about applying, I'd like to turn things over to Susan. Susan,
Steve, I do have one quick one.
Oh yeah, please go ahead, Pete.
Scott, if you've mentioned maximizing the amount that your clients can get, and certainly that makes a lot of sense. One thing we haven't talked about yet is FICA, whether that should be considered in that calculation for what amount you should be eligible for. I've seen a lot of conflicting information on that, and I don't know where that is going to land yet, or does anyone yet know?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, and when you're talking about FICA, you're talking about that being an adder on top of the employer portion being added on top of the gross wages, or where it had originally come out where they were saying subtract that out of gross wages?
Any of the above, however you'd like to answer, because I know that I've seen some documentation that says that should be considered in your payroll calculation for your monthly average from 2019, and others say it shouldn't.
Yeah, and that's where we were seeing that coming from different payroll companies when they were sending out their reports to their customers. They had that in there both ways. And so our firm position in terms of what we've read, and again, we talked to a lot of law firms and so forth, is just gross wages, no plus or minus off of that. So that's kind of what our position is, but you're absolutely right. There could be some more clarification coming.
Great, thank you.
Again, my same mantra as always is check with your advisor, check with your bank. They're the ones that are going to be able to talk about your specific situation and help advise you on that process, which is a perfect segue for us, because the reality is there's a lot of specifics that we're not going to be able to get into everybody's particular specific situation, but Susan does have a handful that we think might apply to a number of people about specific situations and some details that she'd like to pose to Scott. So Susan, take over, please.
Great, thank you. Hi, Scott.
Hello,
We have a
Susan.
few questions. I hope they're not too tricky. But my question, starting with, is what happens if one of our employees decides to leave in the middle of all this? And, we've calculated them in and then they decide to go.
All right, pass, and I'll go to the next question. No, I'm just kidding. So news with that is that nothing inside of the legislation, as far as we've been able to read it, is specific to a particular employee. If someone leaves, you can replace them with another person. It's about your total payroll. It's not about any one person. So that's the best of my knowledge. That would be the answer on that.
So to clarify, does that mean we can either hire someone new or give existing employees a raise?
Yes, you can. Unless they make over 100,000, then you can't.
Then you can't. Got it.
Then you got to find their child or something. Pay their kid.
Okay. And then, we use PEO, a professional employment organization. And how does that factor in? Because we don't have, specific payroll. It's like a payroll expense. We don't have all these details. So what are you suggesting? I know what my PEO did, but what do you suggest?
So again, it's basically what most PEOs did, because PEOs are and for those of you who don't know PEOs, like that is their real deal, is they do payroll for people who don't even want to see the payroll on their own tax ID number. It's like, this is just an expense and a cost. And so typically what I've seen most of them, and Susan, I would ask you if that's consistent with what you experienced, was they sent a nice summary that said, here are the numbers that you're going to want to use. And in doing that, they are in writing telling you, we're not going to claim this. This is yours to claim. And that kind of gets back to what Pete was referring to on the 1099s, is that what we want to do is, what the government and regulations want to do is eliminate double dipping. And so if you have something in writing from the PEO that says, hey, this is what you should be claiming, we're not going to claim it, that's perfect. I would expect that's similar to what you experienced.
Yes, and actually also to add, it was, yes, you answered that correctly.
The sweetest
Also to add,
ask the hardest questions. I knew I was in trouble here, so carry on.
But, a lot of the bankers we spoke to really didn't even know about a PEO and the relationship. So we actually had to get a letter from our PEO explaining what it was and why they were involved. So I think that would probably be another key thing to say, is to make sure to get a letter explaining the relationship, because all these bankers were put in a position where, these are not questions they've been asked before. So I think that's also important.
That's very true. And again, we're learning quickly that all the testing and training and all of that goes into every organization for their client facing people, that as small business owners, it takes a lot to get people trained up to be able to communicate a core message. And these folks that are bankers they're not CPAs. Some are, but for the most part, they're not. Even us as CPAs, I told my kids, I've worked harder these last 2 weeks than I have in a long time, because not only is there all this unknown, so I have to learn plus it's changing and it's frustrating not knowing. And so, yeah, so I'm sure everyone shares that.
Yeah, let me jump in for just a moment here, if I could, because I want to make sure if you're a business that's using a PEO, you already know what that term means. But for those of you who don't use a PEO and it's confusing, and you're wondering, do I have a PEO? What is it that I'm doing? I'd like, if you could, let's break down the different types of employee and employer relationships that there can be. One is you're a direct employer and you manage your own payroll through QuickBooks or through a pad and a pencil or however you do it. And then there's some companies that, while they are the employer of record, that is that these social security numbers and this tax ID for this company are matched up to payroll, they outsource that to a payroll company who manages it, but they as the company are still the employer of record. In other words, the employees work for your company. Then the third category, as I understand it, is this PEO, where this outside organization is the employer of record and you technically have no employees and nothing. And, so if you pay somebody, $75,000 a year, you end up paying that PEO some factor of that, say $90,000 a year, and that covers their fee, and then it covers the taxes and all those other things that you would have to pay as an employer. If you could just help our viewers understand so that they understand where they are in this process. I don't want to use language that just glosses over that.
Yeah. Sorry for using an acronym, but Susan tricked me. So a PEO is a professional employer organization. So they really are. They serve a great purpose in that they can take employees from across huge groups of businesses and put them all together and increase their purchasing power for things like health insurance and so forth. And they just become a very, it's kind of like a one amount that comes out of your bank account to cover all of that stuff, instead of having all of the nuances of enrollments and employee onboarding and all that stuff. They really just kind of come in and they partner with you to do that. So for some organizations, I'm guessing marketing and events is probably one that's really good to use one of those organizations. Some organizations, that's a great solution. For others, it would just be an unnecessary additional cost, because obviously those services carry with them a cost, to which all my PEO consultants out there, they sometimes get offset by the health insurance savings and workers' comp savings and so forth. So those are all good elements. It really is just packaging it all together and putting it aside. And Steve, I think your explanation was perfect. Apart from that, you are doing it yourself or you're hiring somebody just to do the clerical work for you. A PEO is just that next level where they're not just doing clerical work for you, they are the employer of record in handling all of those details.
Perfect. Bob and Pete, do you have any additional questions on this, or want to very quickly run over any additional special circumstances that we may not have covered as we get close to wrapping up?
Steve, I have one more question.
Oh, I'm sorry. Please do.
Yeah, no, not at all. Because I want to bring up, we logged on to QuickBooks this morning and they had a notice saying now they're doing the PPP loans. And of course, we also have a relationship with Cabbage and they're doing them. And of course, our bank. So offline, we were discussing, what are the benefits to using some or others. But I also want clarification is, should we be applying in multiple places, or am I going to wind up in federal prison somewhere if we try to apply in multiple places?
Great question. I would not do good in prison, so I'm very good on the prison questions. I like, I don't know, maybe the Lord will lead me into prison ministry. Then I've got a whole separate concern that I have with all my clients to talk to. But no, I believe that the reality is this, is you definitely do not want to sign documents on the promissory note. So to go through that process, again, you may have already covered this. If so, edit this part out. But there is the intention of wanting to sign up where you're taking that ticket. Then there's the application where you're going through all the process of applying, submitting everything. Then that gets sent to the process through the bank, then sent to the SBA. Then the SBA comes back and says, okay, we are going to make this note and now you're going to sign it and originate it. Okay. In all of those processes, prison would probably only involve that last process. If you sign and receive federal money for 2 applications, you are going to jail. So you better have yourself a get out of jail free card. But I think, if you apply through multiple, it's more of just an ethical conversation. I will tell you, and all kidding aside, these bankers are doing this for really nothing. Literally, they're not allowed to make any origination money on it. They're not, like, the bankers that I know that are working with my clients. I have just been thanking them nonstop, because they're all work through the weekend. They're doing just tremendous amounts of legwork for the sake of just facilitating the getting of the money into the hands of the business owners, and then into the hands of the employees. So they really do deserve a lot of kudos. It's just, and so there's an ethical scenario of, if you send that application up through multiple channels, you're asking someone to do something for not even the goodness of doing it, and you might be impeding someone else. So there's an ethical piece, but apart from that, nobody's going to jail. I don't think for an ethical problem. I think it's more you just don't take 2 doses of money. Okay, Susan? I know you were kind of thinking about that, but I wouldn't if I were you, Susan.
Got it.
All right.
Anybody else have any other thoughts that we can pose to Scott before we get ready to wrap up here?
Yeah, I do have one more question for Scott, if I may, Steve.
Yeah.
Scott, we were talking back on Susan's question about what if an employee quits? Mm-hmm. And we were talking about the impact that makes on payroll, and how much payroll you have, how much you're missing, what effect the payroll section part of it is going to be on your forgiveness. But isn't there also a component of the forgiveness that it counts the number of full-time employees you have?
It does, and again, but it's not. Yeah, it's a great question. And again, it's not the same heads. So we talk about head count, right? Yeah. So you have to have the same number of full-time employees, but you don't need to have the same heads. So that's what we were saying. You can replace that. And for that, that's going to be the least onerous of all of the criteria. That 75% spend is going to be a much harder threshold for a lot of businesses to handle if they've cut a bunch of their employees. Because you can always go out June 29th and hire a bunch of people. You have to maybe clean out some bridges and so forth. You can get some people hired and on your payroll by June 29th or by June 30th. But having spent that 75% is the bigger issue.
Okay, thanks.
Yeah, and we kind of glossed over that just a touch on the when we talked about that earlier. Let me help folks understand. Let's say, for argument's sakes, to use an example, that you've gone through the process and you've calculated your loan amount to be $100,000, just to keep the numbers very simple. Between the 8 weeks that starts on the day of origination and 8 weeks later, if you spend $75,000 on payroll, it will be forgiven. And that allows you to use that other 25%, so the $25,000 for things like rent or mortgage or utilities and things like that, other business expenses. And that's where that 3 to 1. So for every $3 you spend on payroll, you can spend $1 on other approved business expenses, so long as you've reached that $75,000 mark, assuming a $100,000 loan. And of course, you could do the math for your own loan amount. And that's kind of what we were talking about on that 75% spend on payroll.
Yep.
All right, so what other questions do we have before we lose Scott to another meeting?
So I have one more, Steve.
Yeah, please.
And I think our next call should probably focus on forgiveness, because once we all are able to have our applications submitted, secure our funding, our focus is certainly going to shift towards that and figuring out what's going to be some complexities.
Agreed.
There. But one of the things that I've heard over the last day is some grumblings about. It's related to forgiveness that payroll taxes are not going to be forgiven. So if there's an employer whose revenue has gone to zero or close to it, and they're expected, they get the money, and then they pay their employees through that funding. The question is, how are they going to pay for the payroll taxes when they don't have any revenue coming in? Have you heard about that yet? And this may be a premature question, but it sounds like it's a viable concern for folks.
Yeah, and that is, Pete, that is a great segue. It's a perfect segue into next week's program. No, just kidding.
Time for commercial break.
No, so the reality is that, again, if it's a function of gross wages, payroll taxes at the most are 15%. And so what may happen is if we're talking about gross wages, the employer portion of payroll taxes is 7.5%. So if nothing else, it should be calculated or part of that extra 25. I think where that's coming from is there's also a piece of this legislation that says that all payroll taxes can be deferred through the end of this year and not paid until December 21 and December 22, half and half. And so I think that that's probably the bigger underlying contextual piece there, is that it's just, you're not going to be able to get forgiven for stuff that you are deferring as well. I think that might be the reality. But again, this next week or two, just as much as we've heard about the application process and learning the application process, we're going to be learning and disseminating that much on the forgiveness process.
And as we kind of got to have to wrap up here real quick, I'd just like to kind of offer a little bit of a personal commentary, if I would. Remember that, even if some of this loan is unforgiven because you failed to reach 75% or an issue like the payroll tax came up, remember that it is a 2-year amortized loan. Excuse me, I can't speak right. At 1% interest. So the worst case scenario is that you have to pay some of this back in some small way, but the terms are about as favorable as you could ever pray for as a small business owner. And if you do have funds left over that you didn't use, there's no prepayment penalty either. So at the end of the June 30th, you realize there's funds left over and you decide that you don't want to carry a loan payment and you've got funds left over, you can simply pay it off and be done with it.
Or throw it all on Black 29, Steve.
You know what? It's not often that we get a CPA with a sense of humor, and
all right,
and we appreciate it.
Probably should not do that.
All right, guys, we've been going for about an hour now, a little longer than we had anticipated, but with such good information. Scott, thank you so very much for your time, your expertise, and generosity in sharing information with our viewers. For those of you watching, we hope that this has been a helpful and maybe even a little bit entertaining at times process through all of this stuff. Post your questions in the comments below, and we will do our best to answer them after the fact, as well as maybe bring them into our next show. With that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you to our panelists, Susan from Just Events Group, Bob Hyde from We Are Chimera, and Pete Newsom from Four Corners Resources. And we'll see you next time. From all of us here at Omni Productions, see you later.